Alright, welcome back. So in this video, I think this will be actually the last video for chapter 1 of book 2. But we're going to talk about the law of attraction, right? So, like I said, I think I said already, but for me, I like to use the term law of manifestation. So we're going to talk about that in chapters 9 and 10. We're going to talk about it in a much more broad way, but for the moment, the law of attraction to me refers to what kind of grew out. It was around before that, but it's kind of you can almost think of it as a self-help movement, which grew out of mostly from this documentary that came out, I think in 2006, called The Secret, right? So, before I get into it, The Secret, if you're not familiar with it, I was actually remember that, right? Because I was much younger. And I remember when The Secret came out, my brother, he actually gave me, my older brother, he gave me a CD, right, which had this movie on it. And I was like, I didn't know what it was, but I watched it. And it was like most self-help things in the modern day, right? Very inspiring, right? But not a lot of hard theory. And I didn't really know what to think about it, right? I felt inspired, but that's not enough, right? I've always been a theory guy. So even back then, I was a theory guy. So I needed to understand a little bit more about how this works in a sense of theory. Now, I'm perfectly fine with not understanding how it works, but applying it and seeing if it still works in terms of the data that results from experiments. But still, it's something like this is going to be very difficult to run an experiment for if you don't have the hard theory for it, which I knew back then as well. So, I didn't know what to think, but I was a little bit open to it, but I don't know that I was 100% convinced. And then many years later, right, so recently, compared to back then, I had an experience, right? So I started charging my subconscious, charging transcendental belief, right? So I had a goal. Like I said, it's a little personal, so I don't want to say exactly what it was, but it was a goal of mine. And I just kept charging the belief, which I wasn't necessarily expecting anything to happen, right? I just wanted to feel more motivated. So I kept charging my subconscious to have this belief, right? This belief that I was going to accomplish something. And I kept charging it more and more and more and more intensely. Again, I wasn't charging it for intensity, for really any real purpose. It just made me feel more motivated, so I kept charging it. But I was doing other things to sort of to achieve my goal. And that actually ties a little bit into what I call a manifestation charge, which we're going to talk about that in chapter 9. That would have been I actually was doing that a little bit, but there was a special type of charge you would use to manifest the reality that you want. But I was doing kind of the first part of that charge, which is just charging the belief. And I was doing other things too, but that was really the only thing I was charging. I just kept charging the belief more and more and more and more that I was going to achieve something. Now, the interesting thing about belief is that belief doesn't usually reach very high levels of charge or very high levels of intensity, right? I would say in the modern world, right? Because most people sort of just experience their emotions through the subconscious state of something being very new to them, or through shock charging, which results in back and forth behavior. So when most people approach new things that are entertaining, and entertaining things, they really approach for the purpose of charging emotion, not necessarily belief. And so to charge belief, you got to be very motivated. But to get to the really high levels, which sometimes still happens, but doesn't happen that often, in my opinion, I don't think it does, is to reach the really high levels, you kind of have to, you don't need to know how the subconscious works in a more general condition, or the more general situation, which is when something's old, and you're not focusing on things that are new anymore. Some people are literally just motivated enough to do what I did anyway. But like I said, it's rare. But for me, I knew how the subconscious works more generally, so I just started charging the belief. And so basically what I was saying is that it's very few people charge a belief to such a level of intensity that it reaches the really high levels, basically. That's what I believe. Which I've rarely ever charged a belief that strong. And I know that I've never charged it as much as I charged in this case, because I was just deep charging that belief more and more and more. So I just charged a belief, and I started to, I think I said it before, once, I don't know, when I'm charging a belief, and I keep asserting, the belief is basically that I'm going to achieve something. So the frequency is generally a frequency of confidence or ambition and determination. And so when I charge that belief more and more and more, I keep seeing the color yellow. I don't know why. I just keep feeling in my mind this kind of hue, or I can still picture other things that aren't yellow, but it's like part of my mind still sees yellow, like in the corner. I don't know why that is, but it's like a goldish yellow color. But when I charge this feeling of confidence and this intensity of belief, right, eventually I start to see yellow a little bit while I'm still having these stories in my mind. And I would usually, like I was saying before, hey, you know how I said to listen to music to charge emotion? When I'm charging ambition and determination and a feeling of confidence, just to make a belief more and more intense, not necessarily for performance, but just purely for intensity, I'll listen to motivational videos. Like I said, Eric Thomas is one of my favorites. But I'll listen to motivational videos, and that has the proper organizational pattern to help me to charge the belief to make it more intense. And so when I was doing it, I would reach a level of intensity. Like I said, as far as I know, I never reached a belief with that level of intensity in my life. So I reached it for the first time at such a level of intensity that it started to feel like, I don't know, when it gets to a certain level, it starts to feel like something's changing. You know, it's hard to explain it, but like it starts to feel like something supernatural is happening. In kind, it'll make a little more sense when we talk about chi energy in chapter 8. But for now, I just started charging it with such intensity. And what I would do is I would double up, like I would do a deep charge, right? And then I would do a morning charge. So in the morning, when you wake up, as soon as you wake up, right, your subconscious is in a very fluidic state, and it has the properties of when it was excited, when there was basically, the ground state was basically gone. And it has some of the properties of the ground state. So your negative mind, your conscious mind, has some of its negative minded properties. So I explained it in chapter 6, I think. And, you can, for a short moment, you can get a really intense charge going, and right after waking up, which is a morning charge. Now, if you're already deep charged and there's a huge amount of energy in your subconscious short-term memory for some frequency, then you could get a huge boost from your morning charge, and that adds more good energy to your short-term memory. So that's what I would do. And I would wake up in the morning. As soon as I wake up, I would just start charging. I would do this super intense charge of ambition and confidence that I was going to achieve this goal. And so basically what I'm getting at is that the energy reached such high levels, right, that it just felt like it felt like a level that I'd never experienced before, but, you know, who cares? Why does it matter that it reached such a high level? Well, what I noticed as I did that was that it was like things started to change, right? There would be certain events that would happen, and it's like my fortune started to change. There would be little events here and there that would happen that would be aligned with with my belief was, this goal I wanted to reach. In other words, it was like I had this crazy amount of good luck, right? Things just started happening that were just going my way, and I was like, it was so unusual. It wasn't like, you know, a little stroke of good luck where it seems like some special thing's happening, but it's really not. Like, no, this was different. Like, it really seemed like something was happening, right? Like, in a way that was just, you could not dismiss in terms of, you know, a coincidence, right? And I was like, this feels like something supernatural is going on. It felt like my luck actually changed, right? It didn't seem like it changed. It actually changed. But I was like, how? And it reminded me of the law of attraction, right? It seemed like that was exactly what was going on, right? It was like I was attracting things into my life, presumably from having this super intense charged up belief that I was going to achieve something. So that's what made me question The Secret more, and it made me question the law of attraction. And I started to really think about it, right? Because like I said, I never really was convinced by it because I just couldn't understand the medium by which it would work. But at this point, I had the idea of the subconscious mind. The theory was decently developed, and I was just starting to come up with this idea of the superconscious. And then I started to try to analyze, might it work in terms of what I've been calling the superconscious mind. So I started to really try to put it together and see if it makes a little bit of sense. Now, like I said, I believe the law of attraction absolutely is correct, right? I call it the law of manifestation. It's actually the most, like I think I said it already, but it's the one of the most fundamental. I'd probably say it's the most fundamental law of the universe. But really, you're gonna more or less notice it in the when you're trying to explain the metaphysical realm. So it's the most fundamental law in the metaphysical realm. In this universe, in the physical realm, you could say the fundamental laws are just the laws of physics. I would probably say the most fundamental law would have to do with quantum field theory, but I haven't studied that yet. But a lot of the forces in nature are based on, I believe, quantum field theory. And then there's general relativity, which is not a complete theory. Anyway, so in the physical realm, you would study laws of physics, but in the metaphysical realm, you have different applications of the laws of physics, just like you have different applications of the law of manifestation. Just like in the physical realm, you have different applications of what you would call field theory. So like I said, I don't know them. It's called the Standard Model. But I believe from the Standard Model, you can explain the three forces in nature. So you can explain electromagnetic force, strong force, and weak force, all from the Standard Model. So you can think of it as different manifestations of the Standard Model. But the most fundamental law is the Standard Model. Now, or at least it comes from the Standard Model. In the metaphysical realm, it's the same thing. The most fundamental law is the law of manifestation, and then you get different kind of sort of sub-laws that are outpours of that law, or outgrowths of that law. So definitely the law of attraction is absolutely real. I know a lot of people think it isn't. No, right? It is, like I said, the most fundamental law of the universe. It's the reason why in near-death experiences and spiritual experiences, the God and higher beings talk about this law so much, right? Because it's the most fundamental law of the metaphysical realm. But we'll talk more about that in chapter 9 and 10, where we'll be in a better position to talk about it. For now, we're just going to talk about in terms of the law of attraction, which comes from The Secret. So how might this law work, right? That's what I was thinking of. And this is kind of what I came up with. Actually, I forgot to, let me just read this part, which I kind of already asked the question. Well, if the law of attraction is real, what is the metaphysical medium by which such a law would operate through? And to go over this next point, the law could work through the superconscious mind as a result of two parameters. So when I was first thinking about it, I was thinking, well, what I did personally, which made it seem like the law was working, is I charged a huge amount of belief. So I charged the subconscious action or transcendental mental ability of belief, and I charged it to reach such intense levels, right, that it seemed to me like it was causing a change that was attracting certain events to me in certain people. So if we presume it works through the superconscious, which is a subconscious field across the whole planet, I was thinking, well, a charge from me wouldn't be powerful enough, right, to really affect everyone across the planet, right? It just doesn't really make sense. Because like we said, transcendental connection, I'm transcendentally connected to every person on the planet in all living things, but I'm more connected to people. And transcendental connection preserves volatility, right? So presumably, the more volatile my subconscious becomes, it exerts a force, an ambient force, which is almost like a mood that makes everyone else more volatile to the goal that I'm focusing on. But it would be too weak to affect everyone. It doesn't make any sense. So I was thinking about it, and then I was thinking, well, if I adjust two parameters, if there's two sort of, if there's two characteristics that I provide to the superconscious, then it could theoretically work if these two characteristics are true or if they exist, right? And I think Schrodinger, so Aaron Schrodinger, he was a physicist who basically came up with the Schrodinger wave equation, which is the fundamental, pretty much started quantum mechanics, similar to Werner Heisenberg. He started matrix mechanics. But I think when he was, it's been a while since I read it, but I think when he was coming up with the Schrodinger wave equation, he was kind of doing the same thing, just making certain guesses about what equation might find the function or the solution that will model the behavior of where electrons are located, right? And he made certain guesses. He presumed that the equation might look something like the classical wave equation, and he made certain guesses about how it might work. And then when he had it, he tested it and turned out to work. Sometimes that's how you would do it, right? I believe, I haven't done too much of this yet, but if you're setting up like a Lagrange, so this is for physicists or people who are familiar with this stuff. If you were to set up a Lagrangian, right, to model how a particle or how something behaves in the field, you would make certain guesses to set up what its equation might look like. So that's kind of what I was doing. And so there were two basic things that I came up with, right? So just to finish this, the law could work through the superconscious mind as a result of group size and an innate metaphysical intelligence that emerges in the superconscious. So I'm going to break those two things down. So it occurred to me that if I charge transcendental belief to really intense levels, no matter how much I charge it, it's never going to be enough to significantly impact a lot of people across the planet. However, what if I didn't need to affect a lot of, like, billions of people across the planet? What if I was only affecting a much smaller number of people, right? Now, how that works could be discussed and looked into, but let's presume that maybe that's true or that's possible. If I only have to affect maybe 10 or 20 people, then within that size, then my subconscious belief might, yes, have an impact on those people. Now, again, we're not talking about 10 people in the household, right? We're talking about 10 people. Actually, I didn't even mention yet, but if you presume that 10 people are more transcendentally connected within the superconscious, right? So if those 10 people have a very strong connection already within the superconscious mind, they could be anywhere on the planet, but if we're strongly connected, then all of our beliefs could have a strong impact on each other. Specifically, mine can have a strong impact on theirs. Right now, in the other portion, the other aspect of this, is an innate metaphysical intelligence. So that is a little more difficult to break down. That's something we're going to talk more about in chapter 8. But suffice it to say, the subconscious mind, it seems to have the ability to impact external things or influence them. So remember what I said. When your subconscious connects to something, its behavior changes in the way that imitates a likeness of what it was connected to, but it also has the ability to impact what it connected to. So whatever it connected to changes in the likeness to some degree of what's behaving the likeness of me, right? So if I connected to it. And that's very similar to how if you take two masses, right? This is going to Newton's equation of gravity. The mass would pull some particle toward it, but that particle would also pull the other mass toward it, right? And they kind of meet in the middle to some degree, if they're even, same masses. But yeah, so that, let's say, I believe that phenomenon, the subconscious has that ability, right? So it has a certain ability to impact other things, and those things also impact the other subconscious mind, me and other subconscious minds. And there's ultimately a kind of intelligence, right, that emerges. And there's a type of intelligence your subconscious has that is very difficult to sort of notice when you're only looking at that intelligence that subconscious in a more singular form, right? So in other words, if you just focus on your own subconscious mind and you see how it responds and you see all the types of things it does, right? Once you know, we pretty much apply the principles we talked about in all of book 1, then you're going to have a pretty good understanding of what the subconscious mind does. But there's a type of intelligence that it has that's not going to show up when you just observe it on your own by itself, right? There's a type of intelligence it has that it demonstrates when it starts connecting to other people, right? And it connects to other things. And there's a kind of, in those, when it connects to those people, they also have that intelligence. It's almost like a communicative intelligence that formulates, right? And we kind of see something similar with neurons in the brain. And I think you see it similar with ants or insects, right? There's a kind of intelligence that emerges within them. So I believe there's a kind of intelligence that emerges within the superconscious, which is ultimately based on a more innate intelligence of the subconscious that's more difficult to notice when it's by itself. And what it really is a reflection of, or I should say, we're going to talk a little more about that intelligence in chapter 8 when we talk about chi energy. Because when you're controlling your chi, and you're using your chi to sort of manifest some kind of change, which is what I believe chi does, then you notice that same intelligence at play, right? So Now, chi, I believe, doesn't just affect matter; it can also affect metaphysical substances, right? And so, when you're using your chi to when using your chi to manifest something, whether it be in matter or a metaphysical substance, you're going to notice that intelligence come into play. Again, we'll talk more about that in chapter 8. I believe it'll make more sense then. But I believe that intelligence is ultimately at play when a person has a very strong belief to achieve a goal. So the intelligence kind of helps them to achieve that goal. But what's happening goes beyond that. That intelligence is working to help that person achieve the goal, but other people who have a goal, their intelligence is also working to achieve that goal, that innate intelligence that only shows up when a lot of people are involved. And so what really happens is that when people are transcendentally connected within the superconscious, so let's say it's a relatively small group, and they charge very powerfully to belief to achieve some goal, that innate intelligence also charges, right? We'll talk more about that in chapter 8, but the innate intelligence also charges. Not as much, though. There's a reason why, but it charges. And the innate intelligence, you can even say organizes. So there's an organizational effect that occurs within the superconscious. And what it ultimately does is it causes the superconscious to start compelling people, right? So when it compels them, according to the intelligence that it has based on the organizational pattern, just like when you charge your subconscious for creativity, right? Let's say I charge my subconscious to tell a joke. My subconscious organizes. It goes to the humor frequency. It organizes relative to telling jokes, right? So it wouldn't organize for music or writing jokes or things like that. It would organize relative to saying a joke verbally in some activity, let's say a conversation, but it will organize in such a way that allows me to now put jokes together and say jokes and lines and things like that would cause a person to feel the last charge, would cause a person to be stimulated to charge at the laughter frequency. So they would laugh. So the superconscious has a similar phenomenon. The superconscious can organize, right, relative to a particular, some section within it in which a group of people are transcendentally connected more than the rest of the group. It can attain an organizational pattern, and within that organizational pattern, it will start compelling people to do different things. And that organizational pattern represents an intelligence in the superconscious that's causing those people to sort of go here or be at this place at this time, and it'll compel this person to do this thing, right, and do that, and things like that. And ultimately, what ends up happening is that could kind of explain what I experienced, right? So what I was experiencing was certain people just kind of showing up in my life, right? Certain people just kind of being there, or me going someplace at just the right time to see this person, right? How does that happen? How is all of this planning happening when none of us even know each other? I didn't focus on this person or charge my subconscious to kind of connect to this person or anything. Well, it all happens as a result of the superconscious. The superconscious is the one where all this intelligence is being planned out and being coordinated and things like that. And ultimately, it's just a tool that God has given us, right, to help us sort of achieve our goals, right? It helps people who have mutually aligned goals to help each other achieve it. And people who are more transcendentally connected in the superconscious in this way are said to be in alignment with each other, which is actually a correct term. That's something that's said in The Secret, and it's completely correct. Again, we'll talk a little more. These are the basic mechanics of how it works. But in chapter 9 and 10, we'll talk more about it in terms of the metaphysical realm, right, in a more complete way. But this is just basically the theory I was coming up with. So I was thinking, if this is correct, that could explain how it works, right? And I was relatively satisfied with that. I was convinced, right? Now, not everyone may be convinced by that. Like I said, I didn't really break it down in a super hard kind of, I didn't break it down the way I broke down a lot of the stuff spoken about in chapter 1. But like I said, I think this is correct, right? I feel like I can explain a huge amount of phenomena if I accept this as true. And when I discuss it in a more broad sense, in a more technical sense in chapter 9 and 10, I feel like I can explain virtually everything that happens in reality. And you're going to see it, right? So once you understand these principles of attraction or manifestation, so much that goes on in societies just makes perfect sense, right? So, but again, we'll go into it more in that sense in chapter 9 and 10. But yeah, just to kind of recap a little, so when people, if you take multiple people, right? So we're not talking about the whole planet or 7 billion people or however many it is now. If you just take a relatively small group of people who are more connected to each other, now they would be more transcendentally connected and superconscious by virtue of two things. One, what their goal is. So each person has ostensibly different goals. However, in superconscious, they could be in alignment with each other. So their goals are similar in a certain sense, right? And so they're more connected. But the other parameter, it has to do with the belief. So the more their belief is charged to achieve an outcome, right? They add more energy to that group, to that section of the superconscious. So they all add more energy to the group, and there's like a mood boost, mood from the superconscious that boosts their charge, so they charge even more, and they become more transcendentally connected with each other. And then organization eventually happens, just like at the local subconscious level, and then it starts compelling them. Right? And it compels all of them, right? Because all of them are adding energy to this section of the subconscious, the superconscious. It compels all of them to sort of achieve their goal. So if they're in alignment with each other, they may interact with each other one day, like they don't know each other. They don't even realize any of this is going on. But they may interact with each other and help each other in a mutually beneficial way that helps them achieve their goal. So this was actually talked a lot about in the Secret video. The problem with the video, The Secret, that I'll just say before I move on is that, again, the video talks a lot about, it just inspires you. It doesn't talk about the actual mechanics of using the law of attraction. They mostly make it sound like using your negative mind is going to help you achieve the law of attraction, which that has, your negative mind's not going to do anything because it doesn't have any energy. I talk about what a manifestation charge is, because to use the law of attraction more precisely, you would need to perform a manifestation charge, which is actually it's not that the charge is super hard to pull off, but it requires a lot of dedication, right? So we talked about how charging emotion requires very little dedication. I could charge different emotions, reach super high levels very quickly, because the subconscious path is so short, it charges super fast. A performance charge requires much more dedication, right? So it could take a couple of days. I can't jump from this performance charge to that one as easily as I can emotion, because I got to charge up this subconscious path, and this path, and this path, and this path, relative to some activity. And the logistics are tougher, right? So it takes more dedication, more time to charge for the subconscious for performance. A manifestation charge requires the most amount of dedication. You may have to do that type of charge for years before you reach your goal, which means you won't be able to use your subconscious for almost anything else during that time. So we'll talk more about that later. But I just want to mention that because they don't mention this stuff in the Secret video. But some of the things they do mention, I believe, are definitely correct, like being in alignment with people. So this last part that I want to get into just basically talks about a kind of a consequence of these ideas in what we spoke about last video in terms of the mechanics of the superconscious, as well as this innate intelligence factor. What's something I noticed, right? Because when I was kind of coming with this idea, I'm like, well, if it's true that the subconscious is continuously affecting everything, right, across the planet, very weakly, but it is still affecting or influencing it, and it influences it in a way that will reflect a kind of innate intelligence in the subconscious mind that only shows up kind of when you're talking about its impact on other things it's transcendentally connected to. I kind of tried to look up experiments to see if that's true, or if there's some type of experiment that lends some kind of credence to that idea. And then I saw this experiment. So there's what would you call it? A laboratory called PEAR. So PEAR Labs in Princeton University that I don't know what that, so they conducted. So PEAR Labs in Princeton University conducted experiments that demonstrated the effect of emotions on RAG. So that just means random number generators. Actually, I should put RNG. But random number generators. So random number generator is just a computer, right? It's just a program within a computer that will generate a random number. So what they wanted to test is if people's a person's mind could influence the random number generator. So they would test that according to statistics. They know what the statistics should bore. They know what statistical analysis should bore out if it just keeps generating numbers that are completely at random. But it's not going to look super random if something's affecting or causing a bias within it. So they wanted to test if a person's mind or their emotions caused a bias in it. And I think it was after years of research, they determined that it actually does. A person's mind can affect a random number generator, and when their emotions are very, very intense or if it's increased, it has a greater effect on influencing the bias of the random number generator. And they said that, if I'm not mistaken, when 9/11 happened, they saw a huge effect on the random number generator. Now all these people aren't focusing on this random number generator. They're not holding intention that says change it. It just happens automatically. So this seemed to me to lend some credence to the idea that your subconscious is connected to pretty much everything, right? And it does impact it, right? Even without you realizing it, which is how this would work. Because I was so used to focusing on something than charging my subconscious relative to that. So for this to be true, I needed it to also be true that my subconscious has to be influencing things without me focusing on it. And this seemed to demonstrate it. Now, of course, there were some problems with the experiment in terms of its reproducibility, which I'm actually going to talk about those issues that they claim in a moment after I talk about this. But there were issues with the reproducibility, so there are many people who would say this wasn't necessarily true or didn't really happen. That's true for any supernatural experiment. However, if it's real, then it does still lend credence to that idea. Another one I want to talk about was, and you probably heard this before, it's called the 100th monkey experiment. So with the 100th monkey experiment and ones like it, well, I just put a note that it could demonstrate how the superconscious accelerates learning, right? So one thing we haven't really mentioned too much yet is if the superconscious exists, right, and it works according to the way, if it exists and it works according to the way that I'm saying here, it could also result in exactly what it says, accelerated learning, right? Because if people keep focusing on the same event or the same activity and they keep producing an intention that they want to understand something or they want to make sense of something, eventually their subconscious is just going to organize, right? And they charge the transcendental intelligence, so they perceive relationships in a certain way that allows them to make sense of some activity and they can start solving a problem more easily. If that's true, right, and a species continuously keeps focusing on this activity and they're all transcendentally connected, then there's going to be a kind of resonant effect that we talked about, right? So everyone's subconscious is going to charge while focused on the same activity, which means any new person, any new part of that species or member of that species that comes will experience a kind of mood boost, right? So they're transcendently connected to the other part of the species that study this activity and charge transcendental intelligence, and their subconscious organized, right? So the members of the species that have that charge are gonna, it's gonna create an ambient sort of pressure on the member of the species that hasn't performed that charge yet, and that pressure will sort of allow that member to charge that organizational pattern or transcendental intelligence more easily. Same way when you have a certain kind of mood, it helps you to charge your subconscious at a frequency or charge an emotion that reflects that mood more easily. So like I said, that's basically the mechanics of how that would work. So in other words, if you take a member of a species, which they're very transcendentally connected in the superconscious, if a set of the species is constantly learning something, right, then the members of the species who haven't learned it yet physically, right, in the physical world, should be able to learn it a little bit easier as a result of the members who learned it first. So that's something that should happen if this theory is correct. And that's exactly what happened in something called the 100th monkey experiment. I forget exactly what it was. I think there was some monkeys who learned there was like food that they put in sand on the beach or something, and they think it was potatoes, and they would be in the sand though, so there'd be a lot of sand on it, and some of the monkeys learned to kind of wash it off, which something so simple, right? But they learned to wash it off, right? And it made it easier to eat. And so, according to, it's almost apocryphal, right? But according to legend, right, of this experiment, I'll get into what that means in a moment. Other monkeys, or even on other islands, who never had any interaction with these monkeys, who learned how to wash the potatoes so it was easier to eat. But other monkeys just started doing it too, more naturally, more easily, right? Unless they figured it out, they seem to figure it out more quickly, in other words. And that actually, a lot of people have taken that experiment to basically, they basically accept it as supporting evidence for this phenomenon. Now, of course, they don't think about it in these terms of the superconscious, but they believe that there's something that connects us all, that impacts our intelligence, right? And that's actually the study of that intelligence from that perspective, from a more esoteric or supernatural perspective, I believe is called noetics, right? It's a study of noetics. And so this experiment has kind of been, it's been a kind of experiment that is generally hailed as a sort of evidence of that. Now, there are many people who have sort of picked this experiment apart and said it has a lot of errors and a lot of problems and it absolutely doesn't prove that and things like that. Now, here's what I'd say about the people who, and I don't know, I haven't really looked into this experiment, so I'm going to talk a little more about this in chapter 6. Yeah, I keep thinking of chapter 20. No, but it's chapter 6 in book 2. Here's how I look at these experiments. So, yes, pretty much every parapsychological experiment has been supposedly debunked, right, or challenged, or it wasn't a properly controlled experiment, and things like that, which lends to the idea that no experiment has ever demonstrated something supernatural. The problem with that, though, and that's why when they say these experiments didn't work, I'm very skeptical, because when they say that, what's really going on, and again, I'll talk more about this in chapter 6. What's really happening is that the people who challenge these experiments or want to maybe verify it in a more controlled way, what they usually do is they adjust the experiment in some way that actually makes these phenomena less likely to occur. So they introduce a bias into the experiment, so the very phenomenon they're trying to test is much harder to show up. Now, they will tell you that they're not doing that because they're testing the experiment in a way that lacks bias. How can you know the experiment lacks bias when you don't have a positive theory on how it works? A positive theory is basically a theory that says, that explains how something works. And that's basically as opposed to a normal theory, which basically is just more like a normal theory is more like a suggestion on what you would have to do to get the best outcomes. Usually, like, it's about the best way to live a good life or something. It's not a hard theory that could be tested and make empirical predictions and things like that. So, but if you don't have, and we'll get into how empiricism would work for a phenomenon like this that include the mind, because you can't really have a 100% empirical experiment for anything, including mind, emotions. We'll actually talk about more about that next chapter. But I still believe there's an empirical aspect to this. If you don't have a theory on how this stuff works, how could you possibly know that your experiment isn't biased? It doesn't make any sense, right? And so that's a problem that I see that when I started doing the research, like I said, I'm getting a little bit into what I talk about in chapter 5. When I started doing research, because I actually have a theory, whether that theory is correct or incorrect, I at least have a theory to work from in terms of studying these experiments, which is what I actually did. And when I did that, I was absolutely not convinced when they said that, oh, this never worked. I was like, that's not true. You did a whole bunch of stuff to mess up the experiment, right? But at least according to my theory on it. But anyway, my point is, I won't get into in this video, but my point is that I'm very skeptical when they say these experiments didn't work and it wasn't controlled and this and that, because at least from what I've seen, right, they usually will do things that completely mess up the experiment in an effort to try to make it more controlled. But how can you know that what you're doing isn't impacting you? It would be like me saying a person, let's say there's some physiological response that you can measure with some instrument that generally reflects when a person is in love, right? And you're saying that when you measure when you take certain measurements from a person, whatever they are, right, physiological effects or physiological states, you can determine that a person is in love or is feeling the emotion of love whenever you see these parameters show up in measurements. It would be like saying, take some girl, right, and she's like throwing stuff at me, she's kicking me, calling me curse words and things like that, and then testing this theory that the emotion of love will always match up to these physiological conditions. And if she can't cause that within me, then suddenly love doesn't exist. Obviously, you messed up, you put a little bit of bias in the experiment by picking some girl that's cursing me out, right? So I know that's not exactly what's going on here, but I think you get my point. You have to have a theory on how this stuff works before you can ever even make the claim that your experiment isn't biased, right? Because by this theory and my assessment, so many of those experiments that claim those psychic abilities don't exist and all the supernatural phenomena don't exist are hugely biased, and I can point out precisely where, right? And how this theory is basically, in other words, I'm not just saying it based on my opinion. I'm going to the theory that I told you guys about, and I can pinpoint the exact place on where this phenomenon wouldn't show up according to this theory, based on how they always test it. Again, I'm getting a little bit into chapter 6, but my point is that that's why I'm very skeptical of when they say these experiments aren't real or haven't demonstrated some supernatural existence. But still, my theory could still technically be incorrect, and so these things should be tested. But if you want to test my theory, this theory of the superconscious, then these ideas should tell you how to test it in the proper way. And I don't have the experiment, I don't have the resources to test these things in ways that I'd be interested in. So then I just kind of have to leave it at the level of theory for now. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That I kind of went on a tangent with that. But yeah, that's my idea of how the law of attraction would work. Now again, we'll talk more of these ideas aren't super important for what we're going to talk about in chapters really 3 through 8, right? I should say the next chapter, chapter 2. Chapter 2 is more of a philosophy chapter. But when we get talking about the subconscious, these ideas aren't, the idea of the superconscious is not largely important for chapters 3 to 8. It's definitely going to be important for chapter 9 and 10 though. So more transcendental connection is going to be important for chapters 3 to 8. These were just kind of theories I came up with that later on, when I started writing chapter 9 and 10, I realized actually were most likely true. But so it's just interesting to think about and interesting to kind of analyze the world around you in these terms. All right, but yeah, next video we're gonna move on to chapter 2. And chapter 2, like I said, is just gonna be a philosophy chapter. We're actually gonna go away from talking about the subconscious. I'm actually gonna start talking about arguments for the existence of God. So just interesting arguments that I thought would be interesting to talk about before going into the more superconscious application of connecting to God and having a relationship with God. Right, so yeah, that's it for now though, but thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.